The screaming wind of the Dakota Badlands carried more than dust and tumbleweeds on that cursed September morning in 1884. It carried the desperate cries of 5 women whose wagon lay shattered against blood-red rocks, their dreams of new lives scattered like the splintered wood around them. What none of them knew was that their rejection from Deadwood's marriage market had saved their lives from a fate worse than death, and that the half-Sioux trapper watching them from the canyon rim held the key to exposing the most brutal conspiracy the American frontier had ever seen. The morning had started with such promise. Margaret O'Sullivan adjusted her emerald traveling dress for the 100th time as the hired wagon bounced along the rutted trail leading away from Deadwood. At 26, she was considered past her prime for frontier marriage, but her education and refined manners should have made her desirable to any respectable man seeking a cultured wife. Instead, she'd been summarily rejected by banker Cornelius Whitman after 3 days of awkward courtship, dismissed as too headstrong and opinionated for proper domestic life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Beside her sat Elizabeth Chen, daughter of a Chinese merchant, and an Irish seamstress, whose mixed heritage had made her an object of curiosity rather than matrimonial interest. At 23, she possessed a sharp intellect and business acumen that had impressed several potential suitors until they learned of her mongrel background. The final rejection had come from shopkeeper Harold Peterson, who declared he couldn't risk his reputation by marrying Oriental stock, regardless of her other qualities. Across from them, Sarah Blackfeather tried to ignore the suspicious glances from her traveling companions. At 24, the half-Cherokee woman had been brought to Deadwood by a government agent who promised that her education at the Carlisle Industrial School would make her acceptable to white society. Instead, she had faced 3 weeks of humiliation, as potential husbands examined her like livestock before rejecting her as too savage-looking despite the civilized veneer. Ina Kowalski, barely 19 and fresh from the immigrant ships of New York, clutched a carpetbag containing her few possessions and the rejection letter from mining foreman Klaus Brennan. Her broken English and Catholic faith had made her unsuitable for Protestant households, while her poverty made her undesirable to men seeking wives with dowries. The final insult had been Brennan's assessment that she was suitable for certain purposes, but not for marriage to a respectable man. The 5th woman, Victoria Ashworth, sat apart from the others with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to disappointment. At 31, she was the eldest of the group and had traveled the farthest, coming from Boston after responding to advertisements for educated women willing to teach in frontier schools. Her rejection by the Deadwood School Board had been swift and brutal. Unmarried women of advanced age are unsuitable for instructing young minds, as they clearly possess moral deficiencies that prevented proper marriage. Their wagon driver, a weathered man named Ezra Hawkins, had been hired to transport the rejected women to Fort Pierre, where they could catch a riverboat back to civilization. The journey should have taken 4 days through relatively safe territory. Instead, Hawkins had chosen a shortcut through the Badlands, claiming it would save a full day of travel. What he hadn't mentioned was the growing tension between local ranchers and the few remaining Lakota bands who still hunted in the region. The attack came without warning. A rifle shot cracked across the morning air, followed immediately by the terrifying war cries of mounted warriors cresting the ridge ahead of them. Hawkins cursed and whipped the horses into a frantic gallop, but the heavily loaded wagon was no match for the swift ponies of their pursuers. "Hold on," Hawkins shouted, as the wagon careened down a steep slope, wheels bouncing over rocks and prairie dog holes. The women clutched each other and their belongings as the vehicle tilted dangerously with each violent turn. Margaret caught a glimpse of their pursuers, and her blood ran cold. These weren't the romanticized noble savages of dime novels, but hard-faced, men with painted faces and modern rifles, riding with the deadly purpose of warriors defending their homeland. She had read enough newspaper accounts to know what fate awaited white women captured by hostile Indians. The wagon hit a concealed gully at full speed. The impact launched all 5 women into the air before gravity slammed them back down into a tangle of limbs, luggage, and splintered wood. The screaming of horses mixed with human cries of pain as the entire convoy collapsed in a cloud of dust and chaos. When the dust settled, Margaret found herself pinned beneath Elizabeth's unconscious form, her own vision swimming from a blow to her head. Around her, the other women were slowly extracting themselves from the wreckage, checking for broken bones and serious injuries. Ezra Hawkins lay motionless 20 feet from the destroyed wagon, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. The horses had broken free from their traces and were galloping away across the prairie, leaving the 5 women stranded in one of the most desolate regions of the Dakota Territory. But their immediate survival concerns paled in comparison to the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Their attackers were coming to finish what they had started. Sarah Blackfeather was the first to spot him, a lone figure moving with fluid grace along the canyon rim above them. Unlike the war party that had attacked their wagon, this man moved, without urgency or aggression, studying their situation with the calm assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey. "There," she whispered, pointing upward. "Someone's watching us." The other women followed her gaze and saw him clearly. A tall man in buckskins and furs, with long black hair braided in the Lakota fashion. Even from a distance, they could see the rifle cradled in his arms and the knife at his belt. His face was painted with red and yellow stripes that marked him as a warrior. "Another savage," Anna whimpered, her limited English failing her in terror. "We are dead, all dead," but Sarah's expression showed confusion rather than fear. Something about the figure seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. The way he moved, the cut of his clothing, even his posture suggested someone caught between 2 worlds, Indian and white, traditional and modern. Elizabeth, who had regained consciousness and was testing her limbs for serious injury, studied the figure with the analytical mind that had made her valuable in her father's business dealings. "He's not with the war party," she observed quietly. "Look at his positioning. If he meant to attack, he would have done so already." Margaret, despite her terror, found herself fascinated by their observer. In her extensive reading about the American West, she had encountered references to mixed-blood individuals who served as intermediaries between white and Indian societies. Traders, interpreters, and guides who moved freely between both worlds while belonging fully to neither. Victoria Ashworth, her teacher's instincts overcoming her fear, noticed details the others had missed. His weapons are well maintained, but not recently used. His clothing shows wear from travel, not battle, and see how he studies the terrain rather than focusing solely on us. He's assessing the tactical situation. As if responding to their scrutiny, the figure began descending the canyon wall with the sure-footed confidence of someone intimately familiar with the treacherous terrain. He moved from handhold to handhold with practiced ease, covering ground that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer. Anna crossed herself and muttered prayers in Polish, while the other women watched their potential savior or destroyer approach. The sound of the war party's horses was growing louder, suggesting they had perhaps 10 minutes before the warriors arrived to claim their victims. The mysterious figure reached the canyon floor and approached them with measured steps, his dark eyes cataloguing their injuries and the state of their supplies. Up close, they could see he was younger than they had initially thought, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of someone accustomed to surviving on foot in harsh country. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language, but mastered it completely. "You are the women rejected from Deadwood." It was a statement, not a question, and the casual knowledge of their circumstances sent chills through all 5 women. How could this stranger know the intimate details of their humiliation? Margaret, falling naturally into the role of spokesperson despite her circumstances, found her voice. "Yes, we are. Our driver is dead, and there are hostile warriors pursuing us. If you mean us harm, please make it quick." The man's expression remained neutral, but something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "I am Joseph. 2 horses. My mother was Oglala Lakota. My father was French-Canadian. I know these lands better than any man living, white or Indian." He gestured toward the sound of approaching riders. "Those warriors are not hunting you specifically. You interrupted a cattle raid against the Double Diamond Ranch. They attack because you are witnesses, not because you are women." Sarah Blackfeather stepped forward, her Cherokee education helping her understand the complex dynamics of frontier Indian relations. "You speak of them as if you're not one of them." Joseph's smile was bitter. "I am too white for the Lakota, too Indian for the whites. I belong to neither world fully, so I make my own path." He studied each woman in turn, his gaze lingering on Sarah with what might have been recognition. "But that isolation gives me knowledge that others lack. I know why you were really rejected from Deadwood, and it was not for the reasons you were told." Elizabeth's business instincts detected something significant in his words. "What do you mean? We were each rejected for obvious reasons. My mixed heritage, Sarah's Indian blood, Anna's poverty, Victoria's age, Margaret's independence." "Surface reasons," Joseph replied, checking the loads in his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Excuses to hide the real purpose. The men who rejected you were following orders from someone who needed you gone from Deadwood before you learned. Or too much." The sound of horses was very close now. Joseph moved to the canyon wall and began climbing with the same fluid grace he had displayed in his descent. "Follow me if you wish to live. The path is treacherous, but it leads to safety." Anna looked at the sheer rock face in despair. "I cannot climb that. I will fall and die." "Then you will certainly die here," Joseph replied without emotion. "Choose quickly." Margaret made the decision for all of them. Despite her fear of heights and her restrictive clothing, she began climbing after their mysterious guide. Better to die trying than to wait for slaughter. One by one, the other women followed, their survival instincts overcoming their terror and physical limitations. Victoria, despite her age, proved surprisingly agile. Elizabeth's small stature allowed her to find handholds the others missed. Sarah's mixed heritage seemed to include some natural climbing ability. Even Anna, motivated by absolute terror, managed to make progress up the rock face. The sound of the war party reached their abandoned wagon just as the last woman cleared the most dangerous section of the climb. Voices in Lakota echoed through the canyon as the warriors discovered the wreckage and began searching for survivors. Joseph led them along a narrow ledge that seemed to defy gravity, hugging the canyon wall in a path invisible from below. Each step required absolute concentration, as a single misstep would send them plunging to certain death on the rocks below. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they reached a hidden cave carved into the canyon wall. Joseph ushered them inside and immediately began camouflaging the entrance with rocks and brush. "We are safe here," he said quietly. "This place is known only to me, but we cannot remain long. There are others searching for you besides the war party." Margaret, still struggling to process their narrow escape, found herself studying their rescuer more closely. His clothing was a mixture of Indian and white styles, buckskin leggings and shirt, but with a white man's vest and boots. His weapons included both a modern rifle and traditional tomahawk. Even his speech patterns seemed to shift between formal English and the more direct communication style of Plains Indians. "You said we were rejected for reasons other than what?" "We were told," she said, her analytical mind demanding answers. "What did you mean?" Joseph settled himself near the cave entrance where he could watch for pursuit while talking. "What do you know of the business dealings in Deadwood? The real business, not the saloons and gambling halls that visitors see." Elizabeth leaned forward, her merchant background making her immediately interested. "Gold mining primarily, some cattle ranching and freight hauling. Standard frontier economy." "On the surface," Joseph agreed, "but beneath that lies something else, something that requires absolute secrecy to function." He looked at each woman in turn. "You were brought to Deadwood not as potential brides, but as unwitting witnesses to be eliminated if you learned too much." Victoria's teacher instincts made her demand specifics. "Witnesses to what? Murder, theft, conspiracy that reaches from Deadwood to Washington, D.C. Joseph's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "The territorial government, certain mining interests, and military contractors have been systematically eliminating Indian tribes not through warfare, but through poison and disease. What the newspapers call natural deaths from exposure to civilization are actually organized genocide." Sarah Blackfeather's face went pale. "That's impossible. Such a conspiracy would require dozens of people in positions of authority." "Hundreds," Joseph corrected. "And it has been operating for over 5 years, using Indian agents, territorial officials, and local businessmen to distribute contaminated supplies to reservation populations. The death rates are documented as unfortunate but natural consequences of cultural transition. Anna, despite her limited English, understood enough to cross herself and mutter prayers. The others sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Margaret found her voice first. "But what does this have to do with us? We're just women seeking marriages or employment. Each of you possesses skills or knowledge that could expose the conspiracy if you remained in Deadwood long enough." Joseph began ticking off points on his fingers. "Margaret, your education and writing ability could document and publicize evidence. Elizabeth, your business connections could trace financial irregularities. Sarah, your Cherokee background would make you trusted by Indian populations who might reveal the truth. Victoria, your teaching position would give you access to territorial education records showing population declines. Ina, despite language barriers, worked as a seamstress and overheard conversations in multiple languages." The cave fell silent, except for the distant sound of the war party searching the canyon below. Each woman was processing the revelation that their individual rejections had been coordinated to remove potential threats to a massive criminal conspiracy. Elizabeth was the first to grasp the full implications. "If what you're saying is true, then our rejection wasn't personal failure. It was attempted murder. They needed us gone from Deadwood, and if we had simply left peacefully, we might never have learned the truth." "The wagon crash was not an accident," Joseph confirmed grimly. "Ezra Hawkins was paid to take you through hostile territory where your deaths could be blamed on Indian raids. Your driver was expendable once he had served his purpose." Margaret felt a cold rage building in her chest. Throughout her life, she had accepted rejection and disappointment as personal failings, her opinions too strong, her independence too threatening, her age too advanced. To learn that these recent rejections had been calculated attempts to silence her forever transformed humiliation into fury. "How do you know all this?" she demanded. "How can we trust anything you're telling us?" Joseph's smile was grim as he pulled a leather pouch from his shirt and emptied its contents onto the cave floor. official documents, letters, and what appeared to be government correspondence scattered across the stone, because I have been gathering evidence for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth, and because the man coordinating the genocide program is my father. The documents Joseph spread before them painted a picture of systematic extermination that made the women's blood run cold. Letters between territorial officials discussing population management of Indian reservations, financial records showing payments to suppliers who provided contaminated flour and blankets to tribes, medical reports documenting disease outbreaks that corresponded exactly with supply deliveries. Jean-Baptiste Dubois, Joseph said, his voice carefully controlled. French-Canadian trader who came to Dakota Territory 15 years ago and built a fortune supplying government contracts. He married my mother, Singing Bird, to gain access to Lakota Territory and trade routes. When she died of smallpox, the same smallpox he was distributing to other tribes, I learned the truth about his business practices. Victoria examined one of the documents with her teacher's attention to detail. These medical reports show death rates of 60 to 70% in some tribes. That's not disease, that's systematic poisoning. Contaminated grain, Joseph confirmed. Blankets infected with smallpox and cholera. Water sources poisoned with arsenic and mercury, all delivered as humanitarian aid from the territorial government to struggling Indian populations. Sarah studied a financial ledger that showed payments to dozens of individuals across multiple territories. This operation extends far beyond Dakota. Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, there are payments to agents in every territory with significant Indian populations. Elizabeth's merchant experience helped her trace the money flow. The funding comes from multiple sources: territorial budgets, military appropriations, even private mining companies. They're financing genocide to clear land for development. Margaret was reading correspondence between territorial officials and Washington bureaucrats. The casual tone with which they discussed mass murder made her physically ill. They write about eliminating entire tribes as if they're discussing cattle herds. Anna, despite her language limitations, understood the visual evidence of death certificates and population records. She pointed to numbers showing tribe populations dropping from thousands to hundreds over just a few years. "Why hasn't this been exposed?" Margaret demanded. "Surely someone in government authority would investigate such massive death rates." "Everyone with authority to investigate is either part of the conspiracy or has been removed," Joseph replied. 3 territorial judges who asked questions died in accidents. 2 newspaper editors who reported suspicious death rates had their presses destroyed and were driven out of their territories. A cavalry officer who refused to participate in supply deliveries was found dead from Indian attack, despite being found in full uniform with no signs of torture. The women began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just local corruption or individual crime. It was organized extermination with government backing and military support. Victoria looked up from the documents with dawning horror. If this conspiracy is as extensive as these papers suggest, then we're not just witnesses anymore. We're targets for elimination. "Which is why they needed you removed from Deadwood," Joseph confirmed. "Your continued presence increased the risk of exposure. Better to arrange your deaths in the Badlands, where they could be attributed to hostile Indians." Sarah was studying a map that showed the locations of affected tribes and the corresponding supply delivery routes. According to this, the next major humanitarian aid delivery is scheduled for the Pine Ridge Agency in 2 weeks. They're planning to eliminate nearly 3,000 Lakota with contaminated winter supplies. The number was staggering: 3,000 people. Men, women, children, elders, scheduled for death by poison disguised as mercy. Margaret felt the weight of terrible responsibility settling on her shoulders. We have to stop this. Somehow we have to expose this conspiracy and prevent that delivery. With what resources? Elizabeth asked practically. We're 5 rejected women stranded in the Badlands with a half-breed guide. The people behind this: conspiracy control, territorial governments, military units, and vast financial resources. We have evidence, Joseph replied, gesturing to the documents, and we have knowledge of their plans. Most importantly, we have the element of surprise. They believe us dead. Anna spoke for the first time since entering the cave, her broken English carrying absolute determination. My family, in old country, killed by soldiers who say they help. Same thing here, same evil. Must stop. Victoria nodded slowly. As a teacher, I've seen what happens when evil is allowed to continue unchallenged. It spreads like disease until it consumes everything decent in society. Sarah's Cherokee heritage made her response inevitable. My people have suffered from white man's promises and white man's gifts. If there's a chance to prevent other tribes from suffering the same fate, I have to take it. Elizabeth's business instincts were already working on practical solutions. We need allies, resources, and a way to get this evidence to people who can act on it. The challenge is doing so without being killed in the process. Margaret looked around the cave at her 4 companions, women she had barely known 12 hours ago, but who now shared a bond forged by survival and shared purpose. We came to Dakota territory, seeking new lives. Perhaps this is the new life we were meant to find. Joseph gathered the documents carefully and returned them to his pouch. The war party will search for another hour, then return to their own territory. We can leave at sunset and begin the journey to safety. Where is safety? Margaret asked. If this conspiracy extends across multiple territories with government support, where can we go that they won't find us? Joseph's smile held a hint of savage satisfaction. To the one place they cannot control and do not understand, the sacred lands of the Lakota, where their white agents fear to tread and their Indian allies are not welcome. As sunset approached, and the sounds of the searching warriors faded into the distance, the 5 rejected brides prepared to leave their cave sanctuary and enter a world more dangerous than any of them had imagined. They had come to the Badlands as discarded women seeking escape from failed dreams. They would leave as fugitives carrying evidence that could topple governments and save thousands of lives. The question was whether they would survive long enough to use it. The descent from their cave sanctuary began under a moonless sky that turned the Badlands into a labyrinth of black shadows and silver-edged stone. Joseph's 2 horses moved with the silent confidence of a predator in familiar territory, leading the 5 women through passages that seemed impossible to navigate in darkness. Margaret O'Sullivan discovered that her fashionable traveling dress, so carefully chosen to impress potential suitors in Deadwood, was a liability in this harsh landscape. The emerald fabric caught on thorns and rocks, while her leather boots, designed for wooden sidewalks, slipped treacherously on loose shale. Yet she pressed forward without complaint, driven by a purpose that transcended personal discomfort. Behind her, Elizabeth Chen proved surprisingly adaptable to their circumstances. Her mixed heritage had taught her to observe and adjust quickly to new situations. She had already modified her clothing, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind her ankles for better support, and tucking her skirts to allow freer movement. Her merchant background made her naturally practical about resource conservation and strategic thinking. Sarah Blackfeather moved through the darkness with an ease that surprised even herself. The Cherokee blood she had been taught to suppress at Carlisle seemed to awaken in this wild landscape, providing instincts for reading terrain and weather that her white education had never acknowledged. She found herself unconsciously copying Joseph's movement patterns, placing feet where he had stepped, breathing when he breathed. Anna Kowalski struggled most with the physical demands of their journey, her youth and recent immigrant softness making every step an ordeal. But her Polish peasant ancestry included generations of people who had survived by enduring what could not be changed, and she pressed forward with dogged determination, muttering prayers in her native language that seemed to give her strength. Victoria. Ashworth, despite being the eldest of the group, proved to have reserves of endurance that came from years of standing before demanding students and dealing with difficult school boards. Her Boston upbringing had included hiking in the Berkshire Mountains, and she applied those skills to reading the treacherous terrain ahead. For 3 hours, they climbed through increasingly difficult passages, following game trails and watercourses that wound deeper into the heart of the Badlands. The landscape around them grew more fantastic and forbidding, towering spires of eroded stone, deep canyons that seemed to drop into the center of the earth, and wind-carved formations that resembled sleeping giants. "Where are you taking us?" Margaret finally asked during a brief rest in the shelter of a stone arch. Joseph's response came from the darkness ahead of them. "To the place where my mother's people came to speak with spirits and receive visions. It is sacred ground that no white man has ever seen, and where no white man's agents would dare to follow." Elizabeth understood the strategic implications immediately. "A place where we can plan without fear of discovery." "More than that," Joseph replied. "A place where you will understand the true scope of what you face and what resources you have to fight it." Dawn found them standing at the rim of a hidden valley that defied belief. Perfectly circular and perhaps half a mile across, it was completely enclosed by walls of red stone that rose 200 feet on all sides. The only entrance was a narrow cleft through which they had just passed, so concealed that it would be invisible to anyone not knowing exactly where to look. Within the valley, a small stream meandered between stands of cottonwood and wild plum trees. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone walls, spirals, animals, human figures, and symbols whose meanings had been passed down through generations of Lakota holy men. At the center of the valley stood a circle of standing stones, each taller than a man and covered with carved symbols that seemed to shift and move in the changing light. "The sacred circle of visions," Joseph said quietly. "My mother brought me here once when I was 12 years old, after my father had beaten me for speaking Lakota in his presence. She said this place would teach me who I truly was." The 5 women entered the valley with the reverence of pilgrims approaching a shrine. Even Anna, whose Catholic faith might have rejected pagan symbols, seemed to sense the profound spirituality that permeated the place. Victoria approached the stone circle with her teacher's instincts, trying to read the carved symbols. These markings are incredibly old. Some appear to be astronomical observations, star patterns, seasonal markers. Sarah felt drawn to specific symbols that seemed familiar despite her Cherokee heritage. The spiral patterns are similar to those my grandmother showed me before I was sent to Carlisle. She said they represented the connection between earth and sky, past and future. Elizabeth studied the practical aspects of their sanctuary. The valley is completely defensible, with fresh water and shelter, but more importantly, it's invisible from outside. We could remain here indefinitely without discovery. Margaret was examining the petroglyphs with growing fascination. Among the ancient symbols, she noticed what appeared to be more recent additions. Figures that resembled white men, symbols that might represent horses and guns, and a recurring motif that looked disturbingly like skulls. "Joseph," she called, "these newer symbols, what do they represent?" But Dubois had underestimated both the determination of his son and the network of allies the 5 women had built across the territory. Joseph's communication system, though compromised, still functioned well enough to warn of the impending attacks. Anna Kowalski's immigrant network had provided the most unexpected intelligence breakthrough. European immigrants working as laborers at supply depots had observed the preparation of contaminated goods destined for Pine Ridge. Noting unusual security measures and the involvement of personnel who normally had nothing to do with humanitarian aid distribution, they put soldiers to guard food, Anna reported through coded messages that reached Joseph just hours before the supply wagons were scheduled to depart. Not normal soldiers, special ones with no names. They watch poison mixing. This intelligence reached Sarah Blackfeather at Fort Abraham Lincoln, where her military investigation had identified sympathetic officers willing to risk their careers to prevent mass murder. Colonel Reno, despite facing pressure from superiors, who were part of the conspiracy, authorized an emergency patrol to intercept the supply convoy under the pretext of routine security inspection. "We have perhaps 6 hours before those wagons reach Pine Ridge," Reno told Sarah, as they prepared to ride out with a detachment of soldiers whose loyalty was beyond question. "If the contaminated supplies are distributed before we can stop them, 3,000 people will die within days." The race across Dakota Territory became a desperate chase between two forces. Conspiracy agents determined to complete their genocidal mission, and a mixed group of soldiers and civilians determined to prevent it. Sarah rode with the military patrol, her Cherokee heritage finally becoming an asset, as her knowledge of tribal customs would be crucial for convincing Lakota leaders to reject supplies they desperately needed for winter survival. Margaret O'Sullivan's courtroom testimony had reached the highest levels of federal government, triggering an emergency congressional investigation that threatened to expose the entire conspiracy. But the federal response revealed how deeply corruption had penetrated American political institutions. Senator Preston Plum of Kansas, who chaired the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, had been receiving payments from mining companies for years to ensure favorable legislation. His initial response to the genocide evidence was to question Margaret's credibility and suggest that hysterical women were misinterpreting normal administrative procedures. But Representative John Logan of Illinois, a Civil War veteran with an uncompromising sense of honor, recognized the evidence's authenticity and demanded immediate federal intervention. His confrontation with Plum during emergency hearings created a political crisis that divided Congress along lines that had nothing to do with traditional party affiliations. This evidence documents systematic murder conducted with federal funding. Logan declared during heated congressional testimony, "If we fail to act immediately, we become accomplices to genocide." Margaret found herself testifying before congressional committees via telegraph, her words transmitted across the country as federal investigators struggled to verify claims that seemed too horrific to believe. Her Boston education and careful documentation proved crucial in convincing skeptical congressmen that the conspiracy was real and extensive. But she also discovered that some federal officials were actively working to suppress her testimony and eliminate evidence before it could trigger broader investigations. The corruption extended far beyond Dakota Territory, to include officials in Washington who'd been profiting from the systematic elimination of inconvenient populations. Elizabeth Chen's newspaper war had escalated into a national media phenomenon that could no longer be controlled by local interests. The Dakota Herald's special edition exposing the genocide conspiracy had been reprinted by newspapers across the country, while competing publications funded by mining interests struggled to maintain credibility as more evidence emerged. The Chicago Tribune sent investigative reporters to Dakota Territory with instructions to verify or debunk the genocide claims. Their independent investigation confirmed Elizabeth's evidence while uncovering additional aspects of the conspiracy that even she had not discovered. What began as territorial corruption has evolved into a national scandal, Tribune editor Joseph Medill telegraphed to his reporters. This story has the potential to bring down government officials at every level, but Elizabeth learned that media attention was a double-edged weapon. While national coverage made local suppression impossible, it also attracted the attention of powerful interests who had the resources to eliminate journalists who proved too persistent in their investigations. 2 reporters working on related stories had died in accidents within the past week. One in a hotel fire that destroyed all his notes, another in a stagecoach robbery that seemed more like assassination than random crime. Elizabeth realized that her success in generating media attention had also made her a target for elimination. Victoria Ashworth's university investigation had evolved into an international academic collaboration that provided scholarly credibility impossible to dismiss. Professors from Harvard, Yale, and European universities had begun analyzing the genocide evidence using scientific methods that confirmed its authenticity while revealing additional patterns of systematic elimination. The statistical analysis proves deliberate intervention on a massive scale, Professor James Whitman wrote in a report that was being circulated among academic institutions worldwide. The death rates documented in these testimonies show mathematical precision that could only result from coordinated poisoning. But Victoria discovered that academic institutions face their own forms of pressure from powerful interests. University trustees with business connections to mining companies and government contractors were threatening to withdraw funding from institutions that continued researching inflammatory topics that could damage territorial economic development. Her response was to organize an independent consortium of academics who would continue their investigation regardless of institutional pressure. Using their scholarly credentials and international connections, they created a network of verification that could not be suppressed by any single government or business interest. The academic alliance provided something the conspiracy could not: counter, objective analysis by recognized experts who had no financial or political stake in the outcome. Their conclusions were reaching international audiences that could pressure the American government to address systematic genocide within its own territories. As the various revelation campaigns reached critical momentum, Joseph Two Horses discovered the source of the intelligence leaks that had compromised their communication network. The betrayal came from within his own family, his half-brother, Antoine Dubois, who had been secretly reporting to their father while pretending to support the effort to expose the conspiracy. "I tried to warn you away from this course," Antoine told Joseph during a confrontation in the ruins of their childhood home. "Father offered you a place in his organization, a chance to profit from the changes coming to this territory. Your stubborn adherence to our mother's people has forced him to treat you as an enemy." The personal betrayal was devastating, but it also provided crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's final plans. Antoine revealed that the Pine Ridge massacre was intended as the culmination of the genocide program, a demonstration that no Indian population could survive if it stood in the way of territorial development. After Pine Ridge, there will be no more pretense of humanitarian aid, Antoine explained with cold satisfaction. The remaining tribes will be eliminated through direct military action, justified by public outrage over Indian ingratitude for government assistance. Joseph realized that stopping the Pine Ridge delivery was only the beginning of a larger battle. The conspiracy had prepared contingency plans that would continue the systematic elimination regardless of temporary setbacks. As the final day approached, all 5 women found themselves converging on the Pine Ridge area through different routes and for different reasons. Margaret had convinced federal investigators to witness the supply delivery, hoping to provide undeniable proof of systematic poisoning. Elizabeth brought newspaper correspondents who would document whatever occurred. Sarah rode with military units prepared to intervene. Victoria arrived with academic observers who would provide scholarly verification. Anna came with immigrant witnesses who understood government deception firsthand. But they also found themselves facing the full resources of a conspiracy that had spent years preparing for exactly this type of challenge. Dubois had assembled private military contractors, corrupt territorial officials, and compromised federal agents into a force capable of eliminating any opposition while completing the genocide mission. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not just the fate of 3,000 Lakota at Pine Ridge, but the future of American democracy itself. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the stakes could not be higher. He approached the wall she was studying, his expression growing somber. Prophecies, warnings passed down from the vision seekers who came here to understand the future of our people. He pointed to a sequence of symbols that showed white figures, distributing gifts to Indian families, followed by images of death and empty villages. This was carved 3 years ago by Crazy Horse's medicine man, just before he was murdered at Fort Robinson. He saw the death coming in his visions, not from war, but from poisoned gifts. The connection to their modern situation was unmistakable. The ancient prophecy matched exactly what Joseph's documents had revealed about the systematic genocide being conducted through contaminated supplies. Sarah traced the symbols with trembling fingers. The medicine man saw what your father was doing before anyone understood the scope of it. Not just my father, Joseph replied grimly. The visions showed the entire conspiracy, white leaders in distant cities, Indian agents on reservations, traders and suppliers throughout the territories. The medicine man tried to warn tribal leaders, but few believed that such organized evil was possible. Anna crossed herself and spoke in halting English. In my country, we have stories. Old women who see future in dreams. They always write about bad things coming. Victoria's analytical mind was working through the implications. If the prophecies were accurate about the past, what do they show about the future? Joseph led them to another section of the stone wall where more recent carvings depicted scenes of great complexity. White women standing with Indian figures, documents scattered like leaves, and what appeared to be a great council or gathering of many tribes. The final prophecy shows 5 women, not Indian women, but white women, who will carry the truth to the world and unite the tribes in resistance. He looked at each of them in turn. The medicine man's vision showed their faces clearly. He carved your likenesses 3 years before you were born into this struggle. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Among the carved figures on the wall, she could clearly see a woman in a dress similar to her own, with features that unmistakably resembled her face. Elizabeth found her own likeness next to Margaret's, a smaller figure with Asian features holding what appeared to be documents or papers. The accuracy was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Sarah discovered her representation near the edge of the prophecy panel, a woman with braided hair speaking to gathered tribal figures. The carved face was unquestionably hers, down to the distinctive cheekbones inherited from her Cherokee ancestors. Anna's image showed a young woman kneeling in prayer, but with her hands holding what looked like weapons or tools. Despite the primitive carving techniques, the resemblance was undeniable. Victoria found herself portrayed as an older woman standing before a great gathering, apparently teaching or explaining something to assembled listeners. The carved figure even captured her characteristic posture when addressing students. This is impossible, Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. How could anyone have predicted our involvement 3 years ago? Joseph's response carried the weight of deep spiritual belief. The spirits see all time as one, past, present, and future existing simultaneously. The medicine man's visions showed him your faces because your actions were already determined by the choices you would make. Elizabeth's practical mind struggled with the supernatural implications. Even if we accept that these carvings somehow predicted our involvement, what exactly are we supposed to do? The prophecy shows us with documents and speaking to gatherings, but we're 5 women with no resources, no platform, no credibility. You have more resources than you realize, Joseph replied, and this sacred place will provide what you need to fulfill the prophecy. As the morning sun climbed higher, revealing more details of their sanctuary, Joseph directed their attention to what they had initially missed in their fascination with the stone circle. Concealed among the cottonwood groves were structures. Not teepees or traditional Indian dwellings, but carefully camouflaged buildings that blended perfectly with the natural landscape. My mother's people did not abandon this place when the reservations were established, Joseph explained as he led them toward the hidden village. A small group remained here in secret, keeping the old ways alive and preparing for the time when they would be needed again. As they approached the concealed buildings, figures emerged from the shadows, elderly Lakota men and women whose faces showed the wisdom of many winters, younger warriors whose eyes held the fire of uncompromised freedom, and children who represented the future of their people. An ancient woman with silver braids and eyes like polished obsidian approached the group. She spoke to Joseph in rapid Lakota, her gaze studying each of the 5 women with intense scrutiny. Grandmother Many Bears says you are welcome in this sacred place, Joseph translated. She has been expecting you since her dreams 3 moons. Ego showed white women coming to help stop the Deathbringers. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of their situation. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a rejected spinster fleeing Deadwood in humiliation. Now she stood in a hidden Indian village, being welcomed as a prophesied savior. Sarah approached the elderly woman with instinctive respect, recognizing a grandmother figure whose authority transcended tribal boundaries. Grandmother Many Bears spoke to her directly in broken English mixed with Lakota phrases. She says, "You carry the blood of the Cherokee, but your heart has been made white by schools," Joseph translated. She asks if you remember the old ways or if they have been lost. Sarah's response came from depths she didn't know she possessed. "I remember stories my grandmother told me before they took me to Carlisle. Stories of how the spirits speak through the land, through animals, through dreams. I thought they were just stories." Grandmother Many Bears nodded approvingly and spoke again. Joseph's translation carried weight beyond the words. "She says the stories are returning to you because they are needed. The white world taught you their ways so you could use them against their evil." Elizabeth found herself studied by a middle-aged warrior whose scarred face spoke of many battles. When he spoke, Joseph's translation revealed strategic thinking that would have impressed any military commander. Running Wolf says your merchant knowledge makes you valuable for understanding the money trails that feed the Deathbringers. He asks if you can read the white man's papers that show how the poison is bought and sold. Elizabeth nodded, thinking of the financial documents Joseph had shown them. "I can trace money flows, identify funding sources, and understand business relationships. If this conspiracy operates through legitimate businesses, I can help expose the connections." Enna found herself surrounded by children who seemed fascinated by her foreign appearance and clothing. Despite the language barriers, she was soon showing them how to weave grass in patterns her Polish grandmother had taught her, creating an instant bridge across cultural divides. Victoria was approached by a young man who spoke excellent English, having been educated at government schools before returning to his people. "I am Thomas Stands Tall," he introduced himself. "I learned the white man's writing and speaking, but I came back to help my people prepare for the final war." "What final war?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The war between truth and lies," Thomas replied, "between those who would preserve life and those who profit from death. Your arrival means the time for that war has come." As the day progressed, the hidden village transformed into a center of intense activity. The Lakota had been collecting their own evidence of the systematic poisoning, testimonies from survivors, samples of contaminated supplies, observations of suspicious deaths across multiple reservations. Grandmother Many Bears led them to a large lodge where documents, artifacts, and testimony had been carefully preserved. The scope of evidence was staggering, far more comprehensive than even Joseph's collection. "We have been preparing for 3 years," Thomas Stands Tall explained as he organized the materials. "Every suspicious death, every contaminated supply, delivery, every conversation overheard at trading posts, all documented and saved for the day when someone could carry the truth to the outside world." Margaret examined testimony written in multiple languages: English, various Indian dialects translated by educated tribal members, even French and German from European immigrants who had witnessed suspicious activities. The testimonies painted a picture of genocide so systematic and widespread that it dwarfed anything in recorded history. Elizabeth studied financial records that the Lakota had somehow obtained from trading posts and government offices. The money trails showed payments flowing from Washington bureaucrats to territorial officials, from mining companies to Indian agents, from weapons manufacturers to supply contractors. "This is incredible," she breathed. "You've documented the entire financial structure of the conspiracy. With this evidence, we could trace every dollar spent on genocide back to its source." Sarah was reading testimonies from survivors across multiple tribes: Lakota, Cherokee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, even some from as far away as Montana and Wyoming. The patterns were identical everywhere: contaminated food leading to mass deaths, followed by land seizures and resource extraction. "They're not just targeting 1 or 2 tribes," she realized. "This is a coordinated effort to eliminate every Indian population that stands in the way of westward expansion." Anna, despite her language limitations, was studying physical evidence. Samples of contaminated flour, fragments of infected blankets, even bottles that had contained poisoned medicine. Her immigrant experience with poverty and suspicious government officials made her understand instinctively what these artifacts represented. Victoria was most impressed by the educational materials the Lakota had developed. Maps showing the geographic scope of the conspiracy, timelines correlating supply deliveries with death rates, and organizational charts identifying key conspirators at every level of government and business. "This is better documentation than most university research projects," she admitted. "You've created a comprehensive case study of systematic genocide." Thomas Stands Tall smiled grimly. "We learned the white man's methods of organization and record-keeping. Now we use those methods against the white man's crimes." As evening approached, the 5 women found themselves at the center of a war council unlike anything in their previous experience. The hidden Lakota community had been preparing for this moment for years, and their plans were both sophisticated and desperate. Running. Wolf spread out maps showing every reservation, army post, and territorial government office across the northern plains. Red marks indicated locations where contaminated supplies had been delivered. Black marks showed where massive death rates had followed. The pattern was unmistakable: and damning. The next major supply delivery is in 12 days, he explained. Through Joseph's translation, 3,000 Lakota at Pine Ridge Agency will receive winter supplies that contain enough poison to kill every man, woman, and child. Grandmother Many Bears spoke at length in Lakota, her voice carrying the authority of prophecy and the weight of accumulated wisdom. Joseph's translation revealed a plan that was both audacious and terrifying. She says the spirits have shown her the path to victory. The evidence must be carried to 3 places simultaneously: to the territorial capital to expose the government officials, to the largest newspaper in the region to inform the public, and to the army commanders who are not part of the conspiracy. Margaret understood the magnitude of what was being proposed. You're talking about a coordinated revelation that would expose the entire conspiracy at once, preventing them from covering up or destroying evidence. Elizabeth saw the practical challenges immediately, but that would require precise timing, reliable communications, and people willing to risk their lives carrying evidence through hostile territory. Sarah recognized the spiritual dimension of the plan. The prophecy showed 5 women carrying the truth to the world, but it also showed them working with Indian allies, not attempting this alone. Thomas Stands Tall produced additional maps, showing secret trails and safe houses that the Lakota had maintained throughout their territory. We have runners who can carry messages faster than the white man's telegraph. We have warriors who can move through country where no white man can travel. We have allies in places the conspirators never suspect. Anna, following the conversation, despite language barriers, spoke in her broken English. In old country, when bad men take power, good people must work together. All people, not just one kind. Polish, German, Russian, all must fight together or all die separate. Victoria's teaching experience made her appreciate the educational aspect of their mission. If we can present this evidence clearly and comprehensively, the American public will demand action. The conspiracy depends on secrecy. Exposure will destroy it. Running Wolf spoke again, and Joseph's translation revealed the personal stakes for the Lakota community. He says they are prepared to come out of hiding and risk everything to stop the final killings. 3,000 lives at Pine Ridge are worth any sacrifice. Grandmother Many Bears rose and approached each of the 5 women in turn, placing her hands on their heads and speaking in Lakota. The ceremony was clearly some form of blessing or commissioning. She gives you the blessing of the spirits and the authority to speak for all the tribes, Joseph translated. From this moment, you carry not just evidence, but the sacred responsibility to preserve life and expose evil. Margaret felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. When do we begin? Joseph checked the position of the stars through the lodge's smoke hole. Tomorrow at dawn. The prophecy cannot be delayed, and the children at Pine Ridge cannot wait for more convenient timing. As the council dispersed and the 5 women prepared for what might be their final night of safety, each contemplated the transformation that had occurred in their lives. They had entered the Badlands as rejected women seeking escape from failure. They would leave as warriors carrying the hopes of entire nations. The question was whether they would survive long enough to fulfill the prophecy that had somehow foreseen their crucial role in preventing genocide. Dawn came too soon to the sacred circle of visions, bringing with it the reality that their sanctuary could not last forever. The 5 women had spent a restless night in the hidden village, each wrestling with the magnitude of what lay ahead. The plan Grandmother Many Bears had outlined was ambitious beyond anything they had imagined, a coordinated strike against the conspiracy that would require them to separate and face unknown dangers alone. Margaret O'Sullivan stood at the edge of the stone circle, watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Her role in the mission would take her to Yankton, the territorial capital, where she would present evidence to Governor Nehemiah Ordway himself. The irony was not lost on her. A woman deemed too independent for marriage would now attempt to convince the most powerful man in Dakota Territory to act against his own political interests. Elizabeth Chen was studying maps by the early morning. A light, tracing the route that would take her to Sioux Falls and the offices of the Dakota Herald, the territory's most influential newspaper. Her merchant background had taught her the value of public opinion in business dealings, but she had never attempted to manipulate it on such a scale. The success of their entire mission might depend on her ability to convince skeptical journalists to publish a story that would seem impossible to believe. Sarah Blackfeather faced perhaps the most dangerous assignment. She would travel to Fort Abraham Lincoln, where she would seek out Colonel Marcus Reno, one of the few military commanders who had questioned the suspicious death rates among Indian populations. Her Cherokee blood might make her trusted by sympathetic officers, but it would also make her a target for those involved in the conspiracy. Anna Kowalski's destination was the most unexpected: the immigrant communities of St. Paul, Minnesota, where European settlers might be more willing to believe. Stories of government persecution. Her broken English, which had been a liability in seeking marriage, might become an asset in convincing fellow immigrants that American officials were capable of systematic murder. Victoria Ashworth would remain in Dakota Territory, but travel to Grand Forks, where the Territorial University housed a community of academics who might provide scholarly credibility to their evidence. Her teaching background would be crucial in presenting complex documentation in a way that educated minds could understand and verify. Joseph Two Horses would coordinate communications between the separate missions using the network of Lakota, runners and safe houses that had been secretly maintained throughout the territory. The success of their plan depended entirely on precise timing. All 5 revelations had to occur simultaneously to prevent the conspiracy from suppressing evidence or eliminating witnesses. Remember, Thomas Stands Tall addressed the group as they prepared to depart. You carry more than papers and testimony. You carry the hopes of every tribe that has suffered from the white man's poisoned gifts. The spirits of the dead travel with you. Grandmother Many Bears approached each woman with a small leather pouch containing sacred herbs and protective amulets. She spoke to each in Lakota, with Joseph translating her blessings and warnings. She says the path ahead will test not just your courage, but your ability to trust. You will encounter those who claim to be allies but serve the Deathbringers. Trust your instincts over your hopes. Margaret's journey to Yankton began promisingly. Enough, Joseph had arranged for her to travel with a freight wagon driven by a mixed-blood trader named Henri Beaumont, who claimed to have been secretly helping the Lakota gather evidence against the conspiracy. Beaumont spoke excellent English and French, dressed in respectable clothing, and carried papers identifying him as a legitimate businessman with trading rights throughout the territory. For 2 days they traveled without incident, with Beaumont proving to be an engaging companion who seemed genuinely committed to their cause. He spoke knowledgeably about territorial politics, identified potential allies in the capital, and even offered to arrange meetings with influential citizens who might support their mission. It was only on the 3rd day, as they approached the outskirts of Yankton, that Margaret began to notice troubling details. Beaumont's knowledge of the conspiracy seemed too complete, too precise. He knew names and dates that had not been in Joseph's documents. He spoke of future plans as if he had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Montasa, she questioned him about these inconsistencies. His explanations became evasive. His friendly demeanor remained unchanged, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes when he thought she wasn't watching. The trap revealed itself as they entered Yankton's main street. Instead of taking her to the territorial governors, Office as planned, Beaumont directed the wagon toward a nondescript building on the town's outskirts. Men emerged from the shadows, well-dressed individuals who moved with the coordinated precision of professional operatives. "I'm sorry, Miss O'Sullivan," Beaumont said, his accent now carrying hints of something other than French-Canadian. "But your mission ends here. The conspiracy you seek to expose has been monitoring your activities since you left Deadwood." Margaret realized with cold terror that their sacred sanctuary had not been as secret as they had believed. Someone had been watching, waiting for them to reveal themselves and their evidence. The ancient prophecies had not foreseen this level of betrayal. As hands reached for her and the precious documents she carried, Margaret made a desperate decision. She threw herself from the moving wagon, landing hard on the dusty street, but keeping her grip on the leather satchel containing evidence that could save thousands of lives. What followed was a running battle through the territorial capital that would become legend among those who witnessed it. Margaret O'Sullivan, the rejected spinster from Boston, led professional manhunters on a chase through Yankton's streets that demonstrated reserves of cunning and determination that even she hadn't known she possessed. Her knowledge of literature served her well as she improvised strategies borrowed from adventure novels. She ducked through shops, climbed fire escapes, and even convinced a sympathetic washerwoman to hide her in a laundry cart while her pursuers searched nearby buildings. But Yankton was not a large city, and her pursuers had resources she could not match indefinitely. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she found herself cornered in the basement of a church, clutching her evidence and praying for a miracle that seemed unlikely to come. The miracle arrived in the form of Pastor Emil Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant, whose congregation included many mixed-blood families who had suffered from the government's humanitarian aid programs. When Margaret burst into his church seeking sanctuary, his first instinct was to protect rather than question. "They are hunting me because I carry proof of murder," she gasped, showing him documents that detailed systematic poisoning of Indian populations. "Thousands will die if this evidence doesn't reach the territorial governor." Pastor Larsen had seen the unexplained deaths in his own congregation, mixed-blood families who had received government supplies and then suffered mysterious illnesses. Margaret's evidence confirmed suspicions he had carried for months. "The territorial governor is part of the conspiracy," he said grimly, having overheard conversations that suggested official complicity. "But there is another way. Judge Morrison of the Territorial Supreme Court has been asking questions about Indian death rates. He might listen." Judge William Morrison proved to be exactly the ally Margaret needed, a man of unimpeachable integrity, who had been growing increasingly suspicious of the patterns Margaret's evidence revealed. Unlike territorial politicians who might be influenced by mining interests or federal pressure, Morrison's lifetime appointment made him essentially immune to political coercion. When Margaret presented her documentation in his private chambers, Morrison's reaction was immediate and decisive. He had been conducting his own quiet investigation into suspicious death rates, and her evidence provided the missing pieces that made a complete picture of systematic genocide. "This is the most comprehensive documentation of organized murder I've ever seen," he said after reviewing the materials for over an hour. "But presenting this evidence publicly will require extraordinary security measures. The people responsible for these crimes will kill to prevent exposure." Morrison's solution was both brilliant and terrifying. He would convene an emergency session of the Territorial Supreme Court, ostensibly to hear evidence in a routine land dispute case. But secretly, he would invite representatives from newspapers, military commands, and federal agencies to witness Margaret's testimony about the conspiracy. "If we can present this evidence to multiple authorities simultaneously, it becomes much harder to suppress or deny," Morrison explained. "But you understand that once you testify publicly, you become a marked woman. These conspirators have killed. To protect their secrets, Margaret thought of the 3,000 Lakota at Pine Ridge who would receive poisoned supplies in just 8 days. Some things are worth dying for, Your Honor. Meanwhile, Sarah Blackfeather's mission to Fort Abraham, Lincoln was encountering its own complications. Colonel Marcus Reno had indeed been questioning suspicious death rates among Indian populations, but his inquiries had attracted the attention of officers who were secretly part of the conspiracy. When Sarah arrived at the fort carrying Lakota documentation of systematic poisoning, she found herself walking into a web of military politics that made civilian corruption seem simple by comparison. Some officers genuinely supported her mission, while others were actively working to prevent exposure of crimes they had helped commit. Major James Harrison, who had been Reno's most trusted subordinate, revealed himself as an enemy when he attempted to confiscate Sarah's evidence under the pretext of national security. Only the intervention of Sergeant Patrick McKenna, an Irish immigrant who had witnessed suspicious supply deliveries, prevented the documents from disappearing entirely. "I've seen what those humanitarian supplies do to Indian families," McKenna told Sarah as he escorted her to a secure location within the fort. "My own conscience has been troubling me for months. This evidence proves what I suspected, but couldn't prove. The military investigation that followed revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had penetrated Army command structures. Officers who had questioned supply procedures had been reassigned to remote posts. Soldiers who had reported suspicious deaths had faced court-martial proceedings. The poisoning program had military backing at the highest levels. Elizabeth Chen's mission to the Dakota Herald in Sioux Falls presented different but equally challenging obstacles. The newspaper's editor, Thomas Patterson, was initially receptive to her story, but as the scope of her evidence became clear, he grew increasingly nervous about the political and financial implications of publication. "What you're describing would destroy the territorial government and implicate federal officials," Patterson explained as he reviewed her documentation. "Publishing this story could bankrupt the newspaper through lawsuits, or worse, we could face criminal charges for publishing classified information." Elizabeth's merchant background helped her understand Patterson's concerns, but it also provided her with potential solutions. She had brought not just evidence of the conspiracy, but also documentation of the financial benefits that would result from its exposure. "Think of the national attention this story would bring," she argued. "The Dakota Herald would become the most famous newspaper in America. The circulation increases alone would more than compensate for any legal costs." More importantly, Elizabeth had brought evidence that several of the Herald's major advertisers were secretly involved in the conspiracy. The newspaper's financial independence was already compromised by its dependence on businesses that profited from genocide. Patterson's decision came down to a choice between complicity and courage. Publication would risk everything he had built, but silence would make him an accessory to mass murder. Victoria Ashworth's presentation at the Territorial University in Grand Forks faced skepticism of a different kind. The academic community was naturally cautious about sensational claims, and her evidence of systematic genocide seemed too extreme to be credible. Professor Henrik Anderson, head of the history department, examined her documentation with the careful skepticism of a scholar trained to question extraordinary claims. But his European background included knowledge of governmental programs that had eliminated undesirable populations through seemingly humanitarian means. "The methodology you describe is not without historical precedent," he admitted, after hours of reviewing testimony and financial records. "The Roman Empire used similar techniques to eliminate troublesome populations without the political costs of open warfare." Victoria's teaching experience proved invaluable in presenting complex evidence in an academic format that her audience could accept and verify. She organized the documentation into a scholarly presentation that demonstrated systematic patterns impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The university's response exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Faculty members with expertise in medicine, economics, and political science began analyzing different aspects of the evidence, providing independent verification that would be crucial for public credibility. Throughout these separate missions, Joseph Two Horses maintained contact through the Lakota communication network that had been secretly operating for years. Runners carried messages between the scattered locations faster than telegraph lines, while maintaining security that electronic communications could never provide. But the conspiracy had not remained idle. Government agents had begun intercepting some communications and identifying safe houses that had been compromised. The network that had seemed so secure was showing dangerous vulnerabilities. Joseph received word that Henri Beaumont's betrayal of Margaret had been part of a larger operation to identify and eliminate all the women carrying evidence. Similar traps had been prepared for Elizabeth, Sarah, Anna, and Victoria. Only their cautiousness and the loyalty of unexpected allies had prevented total disaster. As the deadline for the Pine Ridge supply delivery approached, it became clear that their coordinated revelation would have to proceed despite incomplete preparation and known security breaches. The conspiracy was closing in on them, but 3,000 lives hung in the balance. The question was whether their evidence could be presented publicly before their enemies silenced them forever. Judge William Morrison's emergency court session in Yankton had been disguised as a routine territorial land dispute, but the men filing into the courthouse on that gray October morning represented the most powerful interests in Dakota Territory. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness testimony that would shatter their understanding of territorial politics forever. Margaret O'Sullivan sat in the witness chair, her once fashionable traveling dress now showing the wear of her desperate flight through Yankton streets. But her voice was steady as she began presenting evidence that painted a picture of systematic genocide, spanning multiple territories and involving officials at the highest levels of government. "Honorable Court," she began, her Boston education serving her well in the formal setting. "I present documented evidence of a conspiracy to eliminate Native American populations through the deliberate distribution of contaminated supplies disguised as humanitarian aid." The audience stirred uneasily as Margaret presented financial records showing money flows from territorial budgets to supply contractors, medical reports documenting impossible death rates, and personal testimonies from survivors across multiple tribes. But it was the involvement of specific territorial officials that caused the real sensation. Governor Nehemiah Ordway's own signature appeared on authorization documents for supply purchases that had killed entire villages. Territorial Secretary Hugh Campbell had personally approved contracts with suppliers who provided contaminated goods. Even some members of the territorial legislature had received payments for supporting Indian welfare programs that were actually extermination efforts. These documents prove that the territorial government has been systematically murdering Native American populations while claiming to provide humanitarian assistance, Margaret testified, her voice carrying across a courtroom that had fallen. Completely silent, Judge Morrison had invited specific individuals to witness the testimony: the Territorial Attorney General, commanding officers from 3 different army posts, editors from 4 newspapers, and federal marshals who could not be compromised by local political pressures. His strategy was working perfectly. The evidence was being presented to too many independent authorities for any single group to suppress. But as Margaret continued her testimony, revealing the scope of financial corruption that funded the genocide program, she noticed subtle movements in the courtroom that suggested not everyone present was a neutral observer. Some audience members were taking notes that seemed more like intelligence gathering than journalistic reporting. Others were quietly leaving the courthouse, presumably to warn their associates about what was being revealed. The conspiracy had infiltrated even this carefully planned revelation. In Sioux Falls, Elizabeth Chen's meeting with Thomas Patterson of the Dakota Herald had evolved into something far more complex than simple journalism. Patterson's decision to publish her evidence had triggered a newspaper war that was spreading across the territory, as rival publications chose sides in what was becoming the story of the decade. "We're going to print a special edition," Patterson announced, his earlier nervousness replaced by the fierce determination of a journalist who sensed the story of a lifetime. 8 pages dedicated entirely to your evidence, with supporting documentation and expert analysis. But Elizabeth quickly learned that exposing the conspiracy through journalism would be far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Within hours of the Herald's announcement, competing newspapers owned by mining interests and territorial political machines began publishing preemptive attacks on the story's credibility. The Deadwood Pioneer, bankrolled by the same mining companies that benefited from Indian land seizures, ran headlines questioning Elizabeth's mental stability and suggesting that her mixed heritage made her an unreliable witness. The Yankton Press and Dakotan, with close ties to territorial government, published editorials claiming that disgruntled former residents were fabricating stories to damage Dakota Territory's reputation. Most disturbing of all, the conspiracy began, using newspapers as weapons in a coordinated disinformation campaign. Stories appeared simultaneously in multiple publications, claiming that the alleged contaminated supplies had actually been sabotaged by hostile Indians seeking to blame whites for their own incompetence in handling government aid. Elizabeth found herself in the middle of a media war where truth and lies were being deployed as strategic weapons. Her merchant background had taught her about competitive business practices, but this was information warfare on a scale she had never imagined. "They're not just trying to discredit our evidence," she realized as she studied the pattern of attacks. Appearing in different newspapers, they're trying to turn public opinion against all Indians by claiming they're the ones spreading lies. Patterson's response was to escalate the newspaper war by reaching out to publications outside Dakota Territory. The Chicago Tribune, Minneapolis Star, and even Eastern newspapers began picking up the story, creating a national media attention that made local suppression much more difficult. At Fort Abraham Lincoln, Sarah Blackfeather's evidence had triggered an internal military investigation that was revealing corruption within the Army command structure itself. Colonel Marcus Reno, despite his controversial reputation following the Little Bighorn disaster, proved to be one of the few senior officers willing to challenge the systematic cover-up of genocide evidence. These supply distribution records show clear patterns of coordination between civilian contractors and military logistics officers, Reno explained to a hastily convened panel of officers from different commands. Someone with significant authority has been orchestrating the delivery of contaminated supplies to Indian populations across multiple territories. But Sarah quickly discovered that the military investigation was as compromised as civilian authority. Several officers on the investigative panel were themselves involved in the supply distribution system, while others faced career pressures that made them reluctant to challenge superior officers who might be implicated. Major James Harrison, who had initially tried to confiscate Sarah's evidence, now found himself under investigation for his role in supply operations that had resulted in suspicious death rates. His defense strategy was to claim that any problems with supplies were the result of Indian mishandling rather than deliberate contamination. These people live in primitive conditions, Harrison argued during heated testimony. Disease and death are natural consequences of their inability to adapt to civilized living standards. Blaming supply quality for problems that result from their own ignorance is both unfair and inaccurate. Sarah's response drew on both her Cherokee heritage and her education at Carlisle Industrial School. Major Harrison, I have personally examined contaminated flour that tested positive for arsenic concentrations that would kill anyone regardless of their living conditions. This is not about adaptation or ignorance. This is about deliberate poisoning. The military tribunal became a battlefield between officers who genuinely served their country's honor and those who had been corrupted by financial interests or racial hatred. Sarah found unexpected allies among enlisted men who had witnessed suspicious supply deliveries but lacked the authority to question their orders. Sergeant Patrick McKenna provided testimony that was particularly damaging to the conspiracy's military connections. I've personally delivered supplies that I knew were contaminated, he admitted under oath. When I raised concerns with my superiors, I was told that questioning supply quality was tantamount to questioning Army efficiency and could result in court-martial proceedings. At the Territorial University in Grand Forks, Victoria Ashworth's presentation had triggered an academic investigation that was approaching the genocide evidence from an entirely different angle. Professor Henrik Anderson had assembled colleagues from multiple disciplines to analyze the documentation using scholarly methods that provided independent verification of the conspiracy's scope. The statistical analysis alone proves systematic intervention, explained Professor James Whitman from the mathematics department. The death rates documented in these testimonies show patterns that are mathematically impossible under natural disease progression. Dr. Margaret Foster from the medical school had examined the physical evidence of contaminated supplies with the thoroughness of scientific analysis. The arsenic concentrations in these flour samples are sufficient to cause mass poisoning. The smallpox contamination of blankets shows deliberate cultivation of infectious agents. This is biological warfare conducted against civilian populations. But Victoria discovered that even academic institutions were not immune to political pressure. The university's board of trustees included several individuals with business connections to the mining companies and territorial government officials implicated in her evidence. As the faculty investigation gained momentum, pressure mounted to discontinue research that could damage the territory's reputation and economic prospects. We're being told that continuing this investigation could jeopardize the university's territorial funding, Professor Anderson confided to Victoria during a private meeting. Some board members are suggesting that faculty who persist in researching these allegations might find their positions eliminated. Victoria's response drew on her years of experience dealing with educational politics and administrative pressure. Professor Anderson, if this university cannot pursue truth because it might be inconvenient to powerful interests, then it has already failed in its fundamental mission. Academic integrity must transcend political convenience. The academic community's response exceeded Victoria's expectations. Faculty members began organizing independently, using their scholarly credentials to lend credibility to the genocide evidence while remaining technically outside official university research. Their analysis provided scientific verification that would be crucial for convincing skeptical audiences. Anna Kowalski's mission to the immigrant communities of St. Paul had evolved into something far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Her broken English, which had been a liability in seeking marriage, became an asset in communicating with fellow immigrants who understood firsthand the dangers of trusting government officials who claimed to be helping. In old country, soldiers, and come with food and medicine, Anna explained to a gathering of Polish, German and Scandinavian immigrants in a St. Paul church basement. They say they help poor people, but food is poison, medicine is poison. Government kill people and say, is accident. Her audience understood immediately. Many had fled European countries where ethnic minorities had faced systematic persecution disguised as humanitarian programs. The evidence Anna presented of similar tactics being used against American Indians resonated with people who had experienced government oppression firsthand, but Anna's most important contribution was revealing how the genocide conspiracy connected to broader patterns of immigrant exploitation. The same supply contractors who provided contaminated goods to Indian reservations were also selling substandard products to immigrant communities, mining camps, and frontier settlements where quality control was minimal. They poison Indians because Indians have land they want, Anna explained, with growing confidence in her English. But they also poison us because we are foreign, different, same evil, different people. The immigrant response was swift and organized. Within days, communities across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa were examining their own experiences with government suppliers and finding suspicious patterns of illness following supply deliveries. Anna had uncovered evidence that the conspiracy extended far beyond Indian populations to include systematic exploitation of any group considered undesirable by territorial power structures. Throughout these separate revelations, Joseph II, Horse's coordination network faced increasing pressure from government agents who had identified key communication routes and safe houses. The Lakota runner system, that had seemed so secure, was showing dangerous vulnerabilities as conspiracy members used their official positions to track and intercept messages. 3 runners had been arrested on various pretexts, while 2 safe houses had been raided by territorial marshals claiming to search for fugitive Indians. The network that had enabled coordinated action was being systematically dismantled by enemies who understood its importance. Joseph found himself forced to rely on increasingly desperate communication methods, coded messages hidden in legitimate trade transactions, information passed through sympathetic church congregations, and even signals transmitted through newspaper advertisements that appeared innocent but carried specific meanings for trained observers. The most disturbing development was evidence that someone within the hidden Lakota community itself might be providing information to government agents. The precision with which authorities were targeting specific network elements suggested inside knowledge that could only come from someone familiar with operational details. As the deadline for the Pine Ridge supply delivery approached, Joseph realized that their coordinated revelation campaign was racing against time in ways they had never anticipated. The conspiracy was not just trying to prevent exposure, it was actively working to eliminate everyone involved in gathering evidence. The multiple simultaneous revelations occurring across Dakota Territory had attracted attention in Washington, D.C. that could not be ignored or suppressed by local political pressure. Federal investigators began arriving in the territory with authority that superseded local officials, while congressional representatives demanded explanations for reports of systematic genocide being conducted with government funding. But the federal response revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had infiltrated national political structures. Some federal investigators arrived with genuine intent to uncover the truth, while others seemed more interested in containing the scandal and protecting implicated officials. The battle was no longer just about exposing local corruption or preventing individual atrocities. It had become a struggle for the soul of American government itself, a test of whether democratic institutions could confront and eliminate systematic evil, or whether powerful interests would prove capable of suppressing any challenge to their authority. As Part 4 concluded, with federal investigators arriving in Dakota Territory and multiple revelation campaigns reaching critical momentum, the stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether 3,000 Lakota at Pine Ridge would receive poisoned supplies, and whether the conspiracy that had killed thousands would finally face justice. The rejected brides, who had entered the Badlands seeking escape from personal failure, were now at the center of a national crisis that would test the fundamental principles of American democracy. 3 days before the Pine Ridge supply delivery, Jean-Baptiste Dubois emerged from the shadows where he had been orchestrating the conspiracy's response to the mounting revelations. Joseph Two Horse's father was not the crude frontier trader that many assumed, but a sophisticated criminal mastermind who had spent decades building a network of corruption that reached from Dakota Territory to the halls of Congress. In his luxurious Deadwood mansion, surrounded by maps and telegraph equipment, Dubois coordinated a campaign of elimination that would silence all witnesses while allowing the Pine Ridge massacre to proceed as planned. His strategy was brutally simple. If the evidence could not be suppressed, then those presenting it would be eliminated. The women have proven more resourceful than anticipated, he told his assembled lieutenants. Territorial officials, military officers, and business leaders who had grown wealthy from the systematic genocide. But resourcefulness means nothing against superior force properly applied. His plan involved simultaneous strikes against all 5 women on the same day the contaminated supplies reached Pine Ridge. By the time anyone realized what had happened, 3,000 Lakota would be dead, and the only witnesses to the conspiracy would have died in tragic accidents that could never be connected to organized murder. But the conspiracy had demonstrated its willingness to kill any number of people to protect its interests. The 5 rejected brides who had stumbled into this massive criminal enterprise now faced enemies with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. As supply wagons loaded with contaminated goods approached Pine Ridge Agency, and forces loyal to the conspiracy prepared to eliminate all witnesses, the question remained whether truth and justice could triumph over systematic evil. Backed by vast wealth and political power, the final hour had arrived, and everything depended on choices that would be made in the next few critical moments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pine Ridge Agency as 2 forces converged on the remote outpost with opposing missions. From the east came supply, wagons loaded with contaminated goods, escorted by armed guards who had been told they were protecting humanitarian aid from potential Indian attacks. From the west approached Colonel Reno's military patrol, riding hard to prevent what Sarah Blackfeather had convinced them would be mass murder disguised as charity. But the real drama unfolded inside the agency compound, where Lakota leaders faced an impossible choice. Winter was approaching, their people were hungry, and government supplies represented the difference between survival and starvation. Yet warnings had reached them through Joseph Two Horse's network that these particular supplies carried death rather than sustenance. Chief Red Cloud, the legendary Oglala leader whose diplomatic skills had kept his people alive through decades of broken treaties, found himself confronting evidence that challenged everything he thought he understood about the white man's duplicity. The systematic poisoning revealed by the 5 women represented evil on a scale that exceeded even his darkest suspicions about government intentions. "The white women bring proof of what our medicine men have seen in visions," he told the assembled tribal council. "The gifts that promise life carry only death. But if we refuse them, our children will starve before the snow melts." Margaret, O'Sullivan arrived at Pine Ridge with federal investigators just as the supply wagons entered the agency compound. Her months of careful documentation and testimony had finally convinced officials in Washington that the genocide allegations required immediate investigation. But she quickly discovered that even federal authority could be compromised by the conspiracy's reach. Inspector General William Hazen, sent by the War Department to investigate the poisoning claims, proved to be exactly the honest official Margaret had hoped to find. His examination of the supply wagons revealed evidence that confirmed her most horrific allegations: flour contaminated with arsenic, blankets infected with smallpox, and medicine that contained deadly toxins. "This is not humanitarian aid," Hazen declared as he tested samples in full view of assembled witnesses. "This is systematic murder using government resources." Jean-Baptiste Dubois had not survived decades of criminal activity by accepting defeat easily. As his genocide plot unraveled under multiple investigations, he implemented a final strategy designed to eliminate all witnesses while creating plausible justification for the mass killing he had planned. His private army of contractors and corrupt officials surrounded Pine Ridge Agency with orders to eliminate everyone present: Indian leaders, federal investigators, journalists, and especially the 5 women whose evidence had triggered the investigation. The plan was to stage a massacre that could be blamed on Indian uprising, triggered by ungrateful recipients of government aid. "If we cannot poison them quietly, we will kill them openly and let history judge the necessity," Dubois told his assembled forces. "The territorial development requires these lands, and no amount of sentiment about Indian rights can change that economic reality." But Dubois had underestimated both the resources arrayed against him and the transformation that had occurred in the 5 women he had marked for elimination. Margaret, Elizabeth, Sarah, Anna, and Victoria were no longer the rejected brides who had fled Deadwood in humiliation. They had become something far more dangerous to his conspiracy: witnesses with credibility, documentation, and powerful allies. Elizabeth Chen's newspaper network had brought correspondents from major publications to witness whatever occurred at Pine Ridge. Their presence meant that any violence would receive national attention impossible to suppress or spin as justified law enforcement. Victoria Ashworth's academic alliance had positioned scholars with international reputations to observe and document the confrontation, using scientific methods that would provide unimpeachable evidence of whatever transpired. Anna Kowalski's immigrant communities had sent representatives who understood firsthand the methods governments used to eliminate inconvenient populations, making them ideal witnesses to identify systematic murder disguised as policy. Colonel Reno's arrival at Pine Ridge, with federal troops loyal to their oaths rather than corrupt superiors, created a standoff that tested the fundamental question of whether American military forces would fire on American civilians to protect criminal conspiracies. The colonel's career had been marked by controversy since Little Bighorn, but his confrontation with Dubois' forces at Pine Ridge would define his legacy forever. When faced with orders from compromised superior officers to stand down and allow the supply distribution to proceed, Reno made a choice that prioritized honor over career advancement. "I have sworn an oath to protect American citizens from all enemies, foreign and domestic," he declared as he positioned his troops between the contaminated supplies and the Lakota families waiting to receive them. "I will not permit mass murder to be conducted under the American flag." The military confrontation that followed was unlike anything in American frontier history. Federal troops faced off against private contractors and corrupt officials in a battle that represented the struggle for the soul of American government itself. Sarah Blackfeather found herself at the center of negotiations between military commanders, tribal leaders, and federal investigators. her Cherokee heritage and white education making her uniquely qualified to bridge cultural divides that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier. "The evidence is undeniable," she told Chief Red Cloud, as federal investigators displayed their findings. "But the choice of how to respond belongs to your people. We can provide proof of the conspiracy, but we cannot make decisions about Lakota survival." The confrontation at Pine Ridge had attracted attention from the highest levels of federal government, forcing President Chester Arthur to choose between supporting territorial officials who claimed to be conducting legitimate policy and acknowledging that systematic genocide had been conducted with federal funding. The president's decision came in the form of direct orders that superseded all local authority. The contaminated supplies would be destroyed. The conspiracy would be investigated by federal prosecutors immune to local pressure, and military protection would be provided for all witnesses until the criminal enterprise could be completely dismantled. Margaret O'Sullivan found herself testifying before congressional committees via telegraph, her evidence being broadcast to the nation as representatives struggled to comprehend the scope of corruption that had been exposed. Her careful documentation proved crucial in convincing skeptical politicians that the genocide allegations were based on facts rather than hysteria. "The American people deserve to know that their government has been infiltrated by criminals who used federal resources to commit mass murder," she testified. "This conspiracy represents a threat to democracy itself, not just to Indian populations." The federal response exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the 5 women who had stumbled into exposing the conspiracy. Congressional investigations led to indictments of territorial officials, military officers, and business leaders across multiple territories. International pressure forced the American government to acknowledge that systematic genocide had been conducted and to implement reforms preventing similar atrocities. Joseph Two Horses faced the most difficult personal choice as federal prosecutors offered him immunity in exchange for testimony against his father. The decision to testify would ensure Jean-Baptiste Dubois' conviction for multiple murders, but it would also destroy what remained of his family connections. "My mother's people deserve justice more than I deserve family loyalty," he told federal investigators as he provided evidence that sealed his father's fate. "The spirits of the dead cry out for accountability." Jean-Baptiste Dubois' trial became a national sensation that exposed the full scope of the genocide conspiracy to public scrutiny. His conviction on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and treason resulted in a death sentence that demonstrated federal commitment to justice regardless of the wealth and political connections of the accused. But perhaps more importantly, the trial revealed the systematic nature of crimes that had been conducted against multiple populations deemed inconvenient by territorial development interests. The evidence presented by the 5 women had uncovered not just Indian genocide, but a broader pattern of government-sanctioned elimination that threatened any group lacking political protection. The 5 women who had entered the Badlands as rejected brides emerged as national figures whose courage had changed American history. But their individual transformations represented something even more significant than their public recognition. Margaret O'Sullivan discovered that her excessive independence was actually the leadership quality that American democracy desperately needed. Her appointment as Territorial Inspector General gave her authority to investigate and prevent future atrocities, while using her education and determination to protect vulnerable populations. Elizabeth Chen's mixed heritage, which had made her unsuitable for frontier marriage, proved to be exactly the cultural bridge-building skill that territorial development required. Her appointment as Territorial Trade Commissioner allowed her to ensure that business relationships served all populations rather than exploiting the powerless. Sarah Blackfeather's Cherokee blood, which had been seen as a liability in white society, became the foundation for her role as federal liaison to tribal governments. Her education at Carlisle, combined with her rediscovered cultural identity, made her uniquely qualified to negotiate agreements that respected both Indian sovereignty and American law. Anna Kowalski's poverty and broken English, which had made her undesirable as a wife, became strengths in her work with immigrant communities who needed advocates who understood their struggles. Her appointment as Territorial Immigration Coordinator ensured that new Americans would receive protection rather than exploitation. Victoria Ashworth's advanced age and unmarried status, which had disqualified her from teaching positions, proved to be assets in her new role as Territorial Education Director. Her maturity and independence allowed her to implement educational reforms that served all children, regardless of their ethnic or economic backgrounds. The Pine Ridge Confrontation marked the end of systematic genocide as territorial policy, but it also established precedents that would shape American civil rights law for generations. The evidence compiled by 5 rejected women had proven that ordinary citizens could challenge and defeat government corruption regardless of the wealth and power arrayed against them. More importantly, their success demonstrated that America's promise of justice and equality could be made real when citizens were willing to risk everything to protect vulnerable populations from systematic oppression. The sacred circle of visions, where ancient prophecies had somehow foreseen their crucial role, became a protected site where future generations could learn about the price of justice and the power of individual conscience to change history. As the sun set over Dakota Territory on the day that should have seen 3,000 Lakota deaths, it instead illuminated a transformed landscape where 5 women who had been rejected by society had proven themselves to be exactly the leaders that American democracy needed most. Their story would be told for generations, not as a tale of romantic adventure, but as proof that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to accept that evil is inevitable or unstoppable. The wagon that had carried 5 rejected brides into the Badlands had delivered something far more valuable. Than wives to a frontier territory, it had delivered the conscience that American expansion had been missing, and the courage necessary to ensure that territorial development served human dignity rather than destroying it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.